20%. That is the minimum amount of actual whiskey required by federal law in a bottle of blended American whiskey. The other 80% can be neutral grain spirit, the same regulatory category as cheap unflavored vodka, topped up with coloring agents and flavoring additives. The bottle does not have to tell you that ratio. The label was approved, and before this video is over, that number is going to change how you read every label in the whiskey aisle. Here's what makes this different from a simple list of bad brands. The problem is not that certain companies are dishonest. The problem is that the labeling system was never designed to stop them from being dishonest. The Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB, reviews every American whiskey label before it reaches a shelf. Proof, age statement where required, class and type designation. Everything measurable gets checked. The founding story, the farmhouse, the Prohibition recipe, the century of family craft, that gets reviewed by nobody. That is not a loophole someone found. That is how the system was built. And by the end of this video, you will know exactly what language to look for and what language to completely ignore. There are 9 brands on this list. The first 5 expose how the system gets used. The final 4 show you what happens when a brand decides not to use it. Stay for the 4th value pick because what that company does with its sourcing should embarrass every brand on the first half of this list. Seagram's 7 Crown. For generations, it has been an American institution, an anchor of casual bar culture, the backbone of a classic serve that entire decades of American social life were built around. The 7 and 7 poured over ice, unremarkable, comfortable, familiar. Here is what most of the people drinking it never knew. Federal standards of identity require blended American whiskey to contain a minimum of 20% straight whiskey by volume. Seagram's 7 runs at approximately 25% straight whiskey. The remaining 75% is neutral grain spirit. Think of it this way. Imagine a can of beef stew on a supermarket shelf. Warm photography, a farmhouse on the label, a recipe that implies grandmother's kitchen. Federal food law requires that can contain a minimum percentage of actual beef. The rest can be broth, thickener, and filler. The label does not have to tell you the ratio. That is Seagram's 7, a product that meets every legal requirement for its category, while delivering something fundamentally different from what the category name implies. The institution exists entirely in the name. That is the first mechanism. Some brands exploit the minimum requirement. The second mechanism is this: what the TTB does not require you to disclose. A company can source every drop of whiskey from a contract distillery in another state, bottle it somewhere else entirely, and wrap it in a label referencing a founding family, a specific region, and a recipe passed down through generations. The TTB does require state of distillation disclosure in certain circumstances, but that disclosure has structural gaps that sourced brands navigate routinely. One distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, MGP Ingredients, produces a 95% rye mash bill whiskey that ends up in bottles carrying dozens of different brand names, different founding stories, different price points, often double the price of more transparent alternatives. When a court ordered Templeton Rye to add the words "distilled in Indiana" to its label and remove the phrase "Prohibition era recipe," that was not a TTB enforcement action. That was the result of a private class action lawsuit that settled for up to $2.5 million. The TTB did not catch it. A law firm did. The regulatory gap between what is legal and what is transparent is not an accident. It is a design feature. Now, Basil Hayden's. This is the one that bothers me most personally. Not because of what the brand does, but because of who it is aimed at. Basil Hayden's is positioned as the sophisticated entry point into premium bourbon. The tall, slender bottle and the layered paper label with its woven detailing signal refinement from across the room. The name references a real 18th century Kentucky farmer who pioneered a higher rye content in his mash. The price sits in the mid to upper premium tier, alongside bottles that have spent considerably more time in oak. And here is the problem. Basil Hayden's is bottled at 80 proof, the legal minimum for bourbon. It removed its age statement in 2014, and current age composition has not been publicly confirmed. It sits in Beam Suntory's small batch collection alongside Knob Creek, which spends 9 years in the barrel, and Booker's, which comes out of the barrel at cask strength. 80 proof and no confirmed age statement. The bottle is doing all of the heavy lifting. Think of it like a speaker system packaged in premium brushed aluminum with a price tag that implies audiophile engineering. But when you test the frequency response, it performs at consumer entry level. The packaging is not lying about what is inside. It is simply louder than what is inside. That is a different kind of deception, and it is entirely legal. If you are new to bourbon and someone hands you Basil Hayden's as your entry point into the premium tier, you are being given the wrong map. Whistlepig 10-year. When Whistlepig launched around 2010, it seemed to represent everything the craft spirits movement was promising. A converted farm in Shoreham, Vermont. A rye-forward philosophy as its defining identity. David Pickerel, who had spent over a decade as master distiller at Maker's Mark, was at the helm. The story was compelling enough to command $60 to $70 per bottle, in a market where comparable rye whiskeys were half that. What none of that story mentioned was that the whiskey inside the 10-year was sourced from Alberta distillers in Canada, as documented in subsequent investigative reporting. The farm was real. The packaging was real. The story connecting the liquid to Vermont craft production was not. Whistlepig has since built its own distillery and incorporated Vermont distilled spirit into newer expressions. But the 10-year, still the flagship, still the product the brand reputation was built on, remains Canadian rye whiskey. At $70 or above, you are paying a Vermont craft premium for liquid that last touched Vermont when it arrived on an import truck. Which brings us to the third mechanism. Heritage dates that outlive the thing they are supposed to represent. Michter's marketing references 1753, positioning a Pennsylvania farmhouse distillery as one of the oldest whiskey operations on American soil. Here is what actually happened. The predecessor operation had closed in the late 1980s. The brand name was purchased by an investment group with no prior distilling history. A commercial operation relaunched Michter's as a non-distiller producer, sourcing from other Kentucky distilleries, while the 1753 marketing implied a nearly 300-year proprietary craft operation. Michter's built a genuine distillery in Louisville that opened in 2015. Their current operation is real. That deserves acknowledgement. But a heritage premium built on a date that refers to a farmhouse silent for over 30 years, purchased at auction by a company that was not there for any of it, is a heritage premium with no underlying continuity. Think of it like a restaurant that buys the name of a legendary closed kitchen at a state auction, hangs the original chef's portrait on the wall, and charges 3 times the neighborhood price because the provenance implies something the food does not deliver. The building permit is legitimate, the lineage is not. The fourth mechanism is the one that operates entirely in plain sight. Jack Daniel's Tennessee Honey sits in the Jack Daniel's section of every liquor store in America, packaged as a direct line extension of the core product, priced like whiskey, and handed to people who trust 150 years of brand equity. The TTB classifies it as a distilled spirits specialty. The addition of honey liqueur and sweeteners legally removes it from the whiskey category under federal standards of identity. Anyone who picks up Tennessee Honey as their introduction to what Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey tastes like, walks away with a false impression of what that name has always meant. Brown-Forman spent over a century building the most trusted name in American whiskey. Tennessee Honey is a flavored liqueur wearing that name. The trust was earned on one product. It is being spent on another. Before we get to the 4 brands doing this right, one question. Which of these 4 mechanisms surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. It helps us understand where the gaps in the conversation are, and it helps this kind of research reach people who are still buying based on the label alone. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling on this thread. Old Forester. Brown-Forman's flagship bourbon has been in continuous production since 1870. The first bourbon ever sold exclusively in sealed glass bottles, a decision founder George Garvin Brown made so customers could verify the contents had not been tampered with. That instinct toward transparency is over 150 years old. Caramel dark fruit and baking spice with a dry oak finish. No allocation games, no invented heritage. Around $25 at retail, though prices vary by market, it has been exactly what it says it is since Ulysses Grant was in office. Larceny, small batch from Heaven Hill, takes the same approach Maker's Mark built its reputation on. Soft winter wheat instead of rye in the mash bill, and delivers it at a price that makes the comparison almost uncomfortable. Brown Sugar, butterscotch, a smooth vanilla finish that never feels manufactured. Heaven Hill operates one of the largest aging whiskey stocks in America, with full visibility into their Kentucky distillery. Around $30 a bottle depending on your market, and it consistently outperforms that price against bottles costing twice as much. It is a bargain. New Riff Distilling, founded in 2014 in Newport, Kentucky, built its identity around a principle that is surprisingly rare. They put a bottled in bond stamp on their core expressions. Under federal law, bottled in bond means a single distillery, a single distillation season aged a minimum of 4 years, and bottled at exactly 100 proof. No blending across sources, and no creative accounting on age statements. Think of it as the difference between a contractor who self-certifies work as premium versus one who submits every project for independent code inspection. The certification changes the accountability structure entirely. In a category full of brands that use the law's silence to their advantage, New Riff uses the law's strictest standards as a selling point. That is a different kind of confidence. Now, that 4th value pick I mentioned at the start. Barrel Craft Spirits out of Louisville does something that should be impossible, given everything we have covered today. They source whiskey from multiple distilleries, and they make that sourcing the entire point. Every barrel release documents where the whiskey came from, how old it is, the proof, and what cask finishing was applied. The batch notes read like honest documentation rather than marketing copy. No founding family legend, no frontier mythology, no 1753 on the label. Barrel Craft Spirits proves something important. Sourcing is not the problem. Hiding sourcing is the problem. When a brand is transparent about it, the whiskey gets to speak for itself. And when the whiskey gets to speak for itself, you can make an informed decision for the first time in this category. 20%. Remember that number. It is the floor the law sets. The brands on the second half of this list decided not to build on the floor. They built higher than they had to, disclosed more than they were required to, and made products that do not need a story to justify the price. Next time you are standing in the whiskey aisle, you do not need to memorize 9 names. You need to memorize 2 words. Bottled in bond. Everything else on the label is competing for your attention. Those 2 words are the only ones the law had to guarantee.